Hi everyone, I'm Lucy. I work with Lydia at Newcastle, and I'm here first of all to confess that I am a comics novice. This is the first time that we use comics as a research process, although I do have a background in participatory methods, visual methods, and we work with a range of stakeholders across our work. So the project that this came from, just to give you a very short background, was a project called FASMED, which stands for Formative Assessment in Science and Maths Education. We were working with science and maths teachers across Europe and South Africa. So it was a large FP7 European project, and we were the coordinating partners. If you are at all interested in science and maths education or teacher education, you can follow the link on our slides. I should also say that in working in such a large project with different partners, we all had quite different backgrounds, different research methodologies, different cultures and assumptions. So whilst we were coming from a position that we very much wanted to work with a range of stakeholders, we wanted to use different methodologies, different research methods, that wasn't the norm across the project, and some of our ideas were met with varying degrees of enthusiasm, shall we say. But yeah, so we sort of approached Lydia and said we really wanted to get the students' perspective on what was happening. So basically a lot of the project was focused upon the teachers and the researchers. They were introducing activities into the classroom, technologies into the classroom, and they were kind of aimed to aid communication between the teachers and the students and between students themselves. And there was a lot of teacher discussion, researcher discussion about what was happening and what was helping, but we felt it was really important to talk to the students themselves. And we wanted to do it in a slightly different way. So everyone did interviews, but we were also thinking, well, what else can we do that is going to push this a bit further? And we knew of Lydia's work in comics, and we were really attracted by the prospect of being able to work with the students over a sustained period of time. So we asked the students, we asked for volunteers, and they gave up their lunch break for 6 weeks, but they committed to that series of working with us in that sustained way. That gave us the opportunity to build relationships with them and to give them time to consider things. And it also gave them the opportunity to feed back information, not just in a spoken way, but in writing and pictures. We also felt that in working towards a comic, that was something the students were attracted to in terms of themselves producing something, and there was a bit of excitement around that they knew that they were working towards the comic. And that would act as a dissemination tool for us as researchers in terms of sharing what had happened with other teachers, with other students, and with other academics. But also for them, they could share what they'd been happening. There'd been a bit of hype in school about what was this FASMED project. Some people were involved, but not everyone was involved. So there was a way that they could share with their friends and family as well what had been happening. I would say that embarking on a project like this isn't always going to be easy, and there were a number of facilitating factors that enabled us to work with the students and with the school in this way. Firstly, and probably most importantly, is that we had a long-standing relationship with the school, that we had a high degree of trust, and that we were working with the school in a mutually beneficial way. So we were always looking as to what the school could get out of what we were doing, what the students could get out of it, as well as what we could get out of it in terms of research data or dissemination. Little things like the fact that they were giving up their lunch break was a really big thing to us. So we wanted to try and give them something back by providing lunch, actually having a shared lunch together. And it was really important that they were going to receive copies of the final comic. It wasn't something we were going to take away and just use for our own purposes. They were the authors, the illustrators, and they were going to have some ownership of that. I think And Lydia will talk a little bit about the process which she very much led on.
Oh, no, but it's,
Well,
I think it's one of those interdisciplinary teams. There's no one person, I think, who could have done all of it. We had a series of 7 lunchtime sessions in a maths classroom in the school. Time was tight. We ended up with about 35 minutes for each session, which sounds pretty good, but within that time we had to eat chicken nuggets and chips and then use wet wipes to wipe our fingers because greasy hands and paper do not mix very well. But I think it is an authentic part of my comics process anyway to involve chips in some way. This isn't exactly the selection of comics I brought, but it's a photo from after a comics convention to give a bit of an indication of the different art styles and publication formats. Again, on your way out, there are examples of other comics projects. This is one I was involved in where we ended up printing 37,000 copies, 37000, and it was huge and lots and lots of people involved, and it looks like an old-fashioned newspaper comic. Equally, the same people make black and white folded over A4 comics, so there's some examples of those as well. And I think getting that point across to the students was incredibly important. This is one of the examples that a lot of these 12-year-olds really did gravitate towards. It's by Neil Slorence. It's called The Amateur Astronomer's Journal. And it's really lovely. He never draws noses on his characters. He does a lot of Scottish national political cartooning as well. So all these politicians, Nicola Sturgeon never has a nose when Neil draws her. But what the kids really remarked on was that the borders are wonky. His production values are still really high. It's still clearly drawn. It's still well printed. He does very well in his career, thank you very much. But it doesn't lose that sense that a human being has drawn this. This isn't Photoshop. It's not about how good and how perfect your artwork is. But getting that point across to kids and having authentic examples to show ended up being very important. The content's suitable in this comic for all ages, even though it's not specifically made for children. And I think, again, that clicked well with our group of 12-year-olds, that it's not babyish and for kids. It really is something that all ages of people can read. On which note, we moved on to do some storytelling activities. For example, I cut up a Mr. Men picture book. So we just used the pictures, mixed them around, used post-it notes to start adding text and retelling your own story. Trying to show that comics is about planning and storytelling. The artwork can be the skin over that skeleton. The artwork is not the be-all and end-all. Many comics critics and readers will say, yes, it is, and it is very important, but for the projects where it's about comics as a process, it needs to be about the planning and what it is you're trying to communicate. So it's a way to get to that core narrative, storytelling, structuring, editing techniques that are common to an awful lot of subjects. We spoke about how it's not about drawing in one particular style, but this step-by-step way to communicate whatever it is that you want to communicate. And that was very important, working with a group that might involve children who are less confident in their drawing skills. But again, I think it rings true for any comics making. The planning started by the children deciding how they were going to split these maths and science assessment lessons that they'd had. So we had some comics that covered all of the different aspects of this particular block of lessons. So I think there were about 3 comics made about each of the different lesson types. Again, the full anthology is at the back, and I did tweet a link if you want to read along with it. Making notes on what kids wanted to include was a way to get them to focus on the content of the lessons, and their task was to make a comic that shows other kids what these FASMED lessons are like. So they did have quite a clear brief, but a lot of flexibility within that. They had a choice of blank panel templates, those bits on the top right there, literally made in PowerPoint, and it's enough to get you started. Some of them I intentionally printed out very light grey so they could then draw their own borders over them, or we could even get rid of some of that as the editing process went along. We called this a vomit comic. The idea is just get it on the page, we'll clean it up, we'll make it look pretty later, just get something on the page. Until that point, it's really difficult to deal with your ideas, but getting them out on the page is very, very useful. This also helped kids decide how many panels they needed to tell the story. Again, there are lots of theories within the practice of making comics that will tell you you need 4 panels for that kind of sequence, or that's really a 16-pager. Whereas here, it was about the kids figuring out what they thought was important. They started off just picking a panel template that they quite liked the look of, whereas some of the comics we did end up chopping panels out where they didn't need it, or by the time they'd done a couple of drafts, they figured out what panel template would suit them better. We talked about what to draw rather than what to write, whether they wanted to show the whole scene or just show close-ups. These images show a bit of the editing process. They use clicky, multicoloured pens. So they labelled what's the location, who are the characters, what is it that you're trying to do, what's the action, as a way to try and to prompt the kids to be clear on what they wanted to communicate. So for example, this part, this 5-6-sided shape, had to decide, do you need to write CCTV camera on the box to show that it is a CCTV camera rather than a light or any of the other many varied things that you get in a classroom. Here what they're doing is hiding from the CCTV camera. The lesson was about figuring out the angle of what the camera can see. And this cropped up a few times. There was this element of humour in kids making comics about hiding in the cupboard or, oh no, where's the teacher gone? But this process made them be really clear on what it was they were trying to show. Once they'd done all the planning, we started with a new page. They did their first sketches and planning in pencil and made any adjustments. They went over the pencil lines in pen as the final artwork that would scan clearly. I took the comics away, scanned them, didn't really do any other changes, set up the pages of the anthology and sent it to print. And then we brought the boxes of printed comics back to the school. Lucy, can I hand over to... Yes, this was launch day. Yeah, that's just snapshots of the examples. But again, this is the final comic. So we did it smaller than A4 because everything's A4 size in a school. So we printed bigger and then trimmed it down. And again, there are copies at the back for you to take away.
So as you can sort of see by some of the pictures, there was this real sense of excitement when the research team brought their comics back and they could be opened up. The students, felt really proud that they'd been part of this process, that they'd produced this themselves. And I think Lydia did a fantastic job at facilitating that, but really making them feel it was their own work, which it genuinely was. They were keen to share that with kind of friends and family. As we said, it was something that kind of people knew about, but not a lot about, so they were kind of handing those out. And it was something that then worked for us as well in terms of a bit of a dissemination project for the project. So it's something we've been able to take round, we've been able to share with other schools, with teachers and with academics, and we were able to take it to our partners, some of which had been quite sceptical about the whole process. So we were challenging them to consider the research findings from different perspectives.
Yeah, and I think particularly the idea of children having authentic and meaningful things to say about the project. That it's not always a given. People talk about pupil voice and student voice in a range of the projects that we work on, and it actually showing them something, they're like, oh, okay, we get it now. That worked well. Another colleague, Ulrika Thomas, and I also used the comic as a prompt when we were interviewing the children a bit further about their participation in the project. So it was partly a traditional audio interview. We'd ask them questions and ask them. Also, what we did was ask them to tell us what they'd drawn, what have you shown here, why did you focus on that, why have you shown it that way, to get to that question of how FASMED lessons were different from other lessons, and again, just to get that conversation going. Equally, we had been working with them for about 6, 8, 10 weeks by that point. Yeah. So I think building that relationship was part of it as well. Then, yes, sharing the comic in different ways. So in addition to what Lucy said about the kids disseminating it and it going out through this FP7 project partners, I've also taken it to comics conventions and to book fairs and to the Baltic Art Gallery and libraries and all kinds of other places, some of which are starting to be places where research dissemination or research fieldwork does happen. And other times this is a wild new frontiers for taking research or child as creator projects into different venues. It also became part of Comic Swap, which is a postal project I run with my colleague Hannah Sackett at Bath Spa University. Kids comics groups around the country who've made comics post in multiple copies to us. We keep a copy for the library with 7 Stories, the National Centre for Children's Books, and then we post out the rest as a mixed bag so they can see what other kids have been up to. realising that not every kid is going to have a local comic shop or local networks or even be able to get out to some of the national or regional comics conventions. And I would also like to, thanks for all the positivity about comics, but equally we're part of a research centre where visual and participative and creative methods are part of what people do. So in some ways it doesn't feel like that much of a departure,
no, it was definitely,
but there are some things specific, I think, to comics. But
no, I think that's true.
Right, lovely, thank you.